I want to quickly hit on two things. Conference realignment rumors. There's a lot of tweets I want to get to, but first, I don't know what to make of this exactly. It says Utah, Arizona, Arizona State, and Colorado are reportedly meeting with the Big 12 Conference today. So this could be a major developing story, but when you click on this article, it makes no reference of the actual tweet that says there is a meeting. So I don't know if a meeting actually is happening today. This could be a developing story. Those four teams have been rumored to have maybe possibly going to the Big 12. There's also been the idea of the merger that I talked about yesterday between the Big 12 and the Pac-12. That seems less likely, and I'm going to explain why in this video. The Pac-12 doing some very interesting things today. From the Pac-12 Board of Directors met this morning and authorized the conference to immediately begin negotiations for its next media rights agreement. To put it in plain English, Pac-12 schools want to understand how much money is on the table for them if the current conference continues to exist post UCLA, USC. If the numbers are bad, they'll quickly try to find new landing spots. So this is not a good sign at all for the Pac-12. They want to negotiate the next media agreement as soon as possible so these schools know how much less money they're going to be getting, how much less attractive is the Pac-12 without USC and UCLA, and I think it's going to be really bad for those conferences. We'll see you can just see, guys, there's some things on the super conferences, there's some stats. Take a listen to this. More people watched the Ohio State-Michigan game, 16 million, than watched the entire season for every Pac-12 school being considered for expansion, not named Oregon. So Washington, throughout their entire season, drew a rating of about almost 13 million people. Colorado was 10 million. Stanford was 10 million. Cal was 2.5 million. The single Ohio State-Michigan game was 16 million. That's really bad. And then here's another thing. This is the SP Plus overall rankings. You can just see the top 25 owned by those two super conferences. And then, of course, there's the idea that Florida State, they're currently number 8. They would join the Super Conference with the SEC. Miami would join the SEC. Oregon possibly to the Big Ten. Clemson to the SEC. And then Notre Dame down there possibly to the Big Ten. So it's just completely owned by two conferences right now. That is almost depressing. And then, guys, this is another thing that I have yet to see. This is the first time I'm seeing this rumor. And it feels like at this point we're just kind of throwing everything out there on these super conferences and, speculation on who the Big Ten's going to add and who the SEC is going to add. Well, this is a crazy one with the SEC. Is the SEC moving west? So this article presents an argument why the SEC should poach Pac-12 schools, which is the first I'm hearing about that. And it has to do with wanting to make an imprint in the West, similar to the way the Big Ten did, taking the two schools from California. With the time zones, now the Big Ten has the Central Time Zone, the Eastern Time Zone, and the Western Time Zone. The only time zone the Big Ten doesn't have a school in is the Mountain West, I believe, which is like Colorado, Utah. But you can see this article, the explanation, a move out west. There is educated speculation out there that ESPN and the SEC are seriously looking at adding 4 former Pac-12 schools to increase their imprint in all 4 time zones. I don't know if there's I have not seen much speculation on the SEC poaching Pac-12 schools. I mean, I guess I can understand it if you look at what the Big Ten did going all the way to California and you want to be, improve your overall conference footprint in the United States. I guess I can understand it, but I haven't seen this anywhere else. Sports Illustrated has already laid out an in-depth piece as to what it could possibly look like. Interestingly enough, it sounds like Oregon and Washington are the main two most talked about going to the Big Ten. So they're speculating Oregon and Washington possibly to the SEC. This article then also does mention the Big 12 still feels most likely, and that's to reference that supposed meeting that's happening today between those 4 Pac-12 schools and the Big 12. While there are several options that could come about for Utah, this is a Utah site apparently, right now it still feels most likely like they're headed towards the Big 12. Jason Schreier of the Arizona 247 Sports Board reported Sunday afternoon that 4 current remaining Pac-12 schools will be in talks. Okay, so there it is. So they're going to be in talk today. This is happening. 4 former Pac-12 schools talking to the Big 12, possibly about going from the Pac-12 to the Big 12. They're talking about getting their right, renegotiating the overall media rights deal right now. It's looking like this is the beginning of the end for the Pac-12. You have 4 of your teams in conference talking to another conference. The Big 12 trying to make its move right now, trying to poach possibly Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah. And what position does that put Oregon in if they're not able to join the Big Ten? Would the SEC be that desperate to expand west to take a team like Oregon? I mean, Oregon's not, you could do a lot worse than Oregon, but there was some concern. Like, the problem is, Oregon is not a slam dunk to the Big Ten like Notre Dame would be. If Notre Dame says we want in the Big Ten, they're going to be in. With Oregon and especially Washington, it becomes a lot more muddled due to the revenue that, or lack of revenue that they generate per year and their overall ratings. But still, I mean, Oregon versus Ohio State, Oregon versus Michigan, those are big-time games, and Oregon is huge on the NIL. I think they would be a fine addition for the Big Ten, but once again, this all comes down to money. Now, getting to some interesting rumors. Oklahoma State and TCU saying they have had the Pac-12 reach out to them through back channels to gauge interest in joining the Pac-12. This is just, it seems like the Pac-12, from my point of view, is completely desperate. And obviously, I would be shocked if these 2 teams did anything, but very interesting here. Oklahoma State and TCU, the Pac-12, so desperate to get any traction. We thought the idea maybe the Pac-12 and the Big 12 could merge. It's looking more and more likely. All the other conferences are going to eat the Pac-12. And the Pac-12, I don't know what happens to it. I don't know if it dissolves or if it just becomes maybe a slightly better version of the Mountain West. Because my question is, what happens to Washington State, Oregon State, and then maybe a team like California? Unless California can latch on to the Big Ten. Maybe they can. I don't know. There's been speculation on that. Pac-12 has no major network lined up to bid on their next contract other than ESPN, and that's in reference to my video I just did talking about Fox Sports wanting nothing to do with the Pac-12 based on the situation with USC and UCLA leaving for the Big Ten. Consensus among Big 12 is that Pac-12 new contract with ESPN will be AAC, that's American Conference level, assuming at least Oregon leaves. There might be a lot more than Oregon that leaves. Now, adding Oregon and Washington to the list would help increase money per school. Adding Oregon and Washington to the Big 12, that's what they're referencing. They wouldn't hit the Big 10 or the SEC levels, but they would be ahead of where the current Big 12 and Pac-12 contracts are paying out. Big 12 doesn't stand to gain a lot from the Four Corners schools. They will gain more strength. And yeah, really, if you're the Big 12 and you can add Oregon, that's an amazing get. And it's not just to do with money. It's about being relevant. Oregon adds a great deal of relevance to your conference. If the Big 12 somehow got Oregon, it's not going to add a ton of money. But like this tweet is saying, you won't lose money per school on the next contract, and you will gain perception. The conference will be more respected. And so that's the idea of maybe Oregon, if they're not able to latch on to the Big Ten, which is where I'm sure they want to go because they'd make so much more money, maybe they settle for the Big 12 and their expanded conference. But guys, right now, we've got some major rumors that these 4 teams from the Pac-12 are meeting with the Big 12 currently. I wonder what the talks of that negotiation will end up being. Presumably, the expectation is there's some form of negotiation going on for those 4 teams to potentially join the Big 12 conference. It looks like it's Utah. It's the teams I talked about last week. It's Utah, Colorado, Arizona State, and Arizona possibly going to the Big 12, at least meeting right now. And then if Oregon gets shut out from the Big Ten, would the SEC, again, that's the other thing they're saying now, would the SEC say, listen, because the Big Ten expanded so greatly all across America, we need to get some teams, we need a Western footprint. And that's where Oregon and Washington possibly to the SEC comes into play. If they're not wanted in the Big Ten. So it's a very interesting scenario that we're going to continue to track. Obviously, these teams, you can see, this is another article talking about it. Which direction could the SEC expansion go next? And it says, it talked about the East, it talked about Clemson, all those teams, it talked about the Midwest and Notre Dame and how it really doesn't make sense. And then this article talks about the West, and it says, this is the direction to watch. And in many ways makes the most sense in the short term. Should the SEC look beyond Texas, where it has Dallas and Houston secure, the next major markets in that direction geographically are Phoenix and Denver, which translates to Arizona State and Colorado, which I don't think that's going to happen at all. I would be shocked if the SEC added either Arizona State or Colorado just for the sake of having a footprint. I think if you really want a Western footprint, just take Oregon and take that, Washington, upper Washington area market, the upper West part of the United States. I don't see much of, because think about it, if Oregon isn't accepted into the Big Ten due to their revenue, how would a team like Colorado get into the SEC? That would be shocking to me. So we could see some, SEC expansion. I still think the most likely scenario right now, the SEC taking and poaching for the best teams from the ACC, Clemson, FSU, Miami, and whoever else. The Big Ten gets Oregon, Washington, Notre Dame, and possibly Stanford. And then the Big 12 takes these 4 rumored Pac-12 schools, which would be Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah, and then the Big 12 to expand to the 20-team Super Conference, because that would only get them to 16. To expand to the 20-team Super Conference, they would also take 4 more teams from the ACC, which at that point would be known as a feeder conference. If Clemson and all the other major schools left for the SEC, you would try and get, maybe a Boston College, maybe a Virginia. I'm just speculating on who the Big 12 would try and take at that point. And the most logical scenario right now is a 3-team Super Conference with the 2 top conferences owning so much of the power, and then the Big 12 lagging behind as the 3rd Super Conference, with the ACC turning into a feeder conference. I don't know who the ACC would get at that point. I don't know if they would try and pick teams off of the American, and then you would have also the Pac-12, a feeder conference or a sub-conference, however you want to define it. They would be trying to pick teams off of the Mountain West, or maybe the conferences would just dissolve. I don't know. Something like this has never happened. I would imagine they would try and just get like Boise State, although there was a rumor that Boise State wants in the Big 12, which is very smart. Boise State is seeing that the Big 12 is going to be the 3rd so-called super conference, and they want to get in. They want their application reopened. And if I was the Big 12, I would be very interested in Boise State. I think they have a lot of staying power. Unfortunately, they're not that popular So they don't have great ratings. They're not going to help your TV contracts very much. That's why the Big 12 might stay away from Boise State. In that event, Boise State might have to look to the new Pac-12, which would be a sub-conference at that point, and the Pac-12 would have to look at teams like San Diego State, San Jose State, Boise State, Fresno State, the Mountain West teams, maybe a Wyoming, and it would be really ugly for the Pac-12. And to me right now, the direction it's trending, really bad news for the Pac-12. The ACC is hanging on by a thread. The Big 12 is forming a super conference as far as I can see right now. Maybe the merger still happens between the Big 12 and the Pac-12. But if you have 4 Pac-12 schools meeting with the Big 12, that tells me those 4 schools want to leave the Pac-12. There's not going to be a merger. That's what that tells me personally right now as I see it. So we will have to see what ends up happening, guys. Continue to update it. That's going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on Twitter. Link to that's always in the description.